Hi. Okay, my name is Amy Stein. I have a lot of slides to show, and so I'm going to go through the first bit. Well, I'm going to go through it as I go through it, but I want to tell you, I want to start at the beginning, which for me was in about 2001, 2002, I decided to become a photographer. Before that time, I was living in Washington, D.C., and sometimes in New York. I was going back and forth, and working in politics. And I have an undergrad and grad degree in political science, and I thought I was going to become a foreign service officer, which was what my parents were. And so since I was very young, I just thought I would be, I'm from DC, I thought I would be involved in political science and working in politics in Washington. But many things worked against that plan, and I ended up I was working in Washington, D.C., I ended up working for a .com around 2000. And that brought me up to New York. And I worked for a couple .coms, but then in 2001, 2002, the .com started closing, and ours did too. And I found myself without a job and with no prospects of a job because I was now living in New York, and I didn't really want to return to Washington and kind of get back into the Hill and things like that. So I was living in Brooklyn in a really nice apartment, and I was unemployed. Unemployed and not had no prospects of really finding something in my industry. And so this is actually what happened. This is how the story goes. I was sitting in my sort of second living room at the time, couldn't afford it, had to move, and thinking, well, what am I going to do now? And I was on the table were a few magazines, like probably National Geographic Traveler, maybe there was like a Life or a Time, photo magazines really. And I said, well, I think I'm going to become a photographer. And I had no clue how hard that would be, what that meant, really what it meant. I thought maybe I'll be a travel photographer or a photojournalist. I sort of had no sense of that there was a fine art world around photography. I hadn't really been to the galleries at that point, which is sort of a sad thing. But I'd been living in New York for a couple years at that point, and I just started telling a few friends and a few of my cousins and things that my boyfriend, I'm a photographer now. I'm going to be a photographer. So I didn't really know how a camera worked. I didn't really know much about photography. I knew, what most people know. I liked photography. Some, photographs moved me at certain points in my life, but I didn't know how to do it. So very quickly, I got myself to the ICP. I kind of pieced together a basic technical education there. Very quickly, I learned that I could take, instead of paying for classes, I could assist classes and be in the classroom with teachers and take classes basically for free, which was very helpful. And that led to a summer at the Maine photographic workshops. So I knew I had to kind of cobble together an education and a community around photography, which became very important to me because trying to do it on your own is virtually impossible, very difficult. So I applied to the Maine photographic workshops to work for the summer. And that was the summer of 2002. And I was accepted and I became an assistant. And through that process, I was able to assist many different photographers in the classroom over a 10-week, 12-week summer. So every week a different photographer/teacher would come. And it was from the gamut of, like, the range was landscape photographers, portrait photographers, fine art photographers, travel photographers, photojournalists. It was really kind of an amazing experience. So I learned a lot there. This summer, and at this time I was taking pictures, trying a few early experiments, trying to learn how to become a photographer, not just technically, but also the kind of process of being a photographer, the process of finding stories, talking to people, getting access, making images and then editing images and then finding out what's working for you. So after that summer, I was asked to go to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which became a very important place for me. I ended up getting married there. It's a town called Easton, Maryland, because the Maine Photo Workshops was doing a sort of a special fall semester there. And it was there that I started my first project, which is called Women and Guns. It's not a project I finished. It's a project I show when I talk about my work because it's a project that really allowed me to learn how to become a photographer, learn how to work with people, find people to photograph, come up with a sort of a topic or a concept, and just, actually get in front of people and make images, which sometimes can be a really terrifying prospect for someone who's just learning how to do it. So I show this work because this is the project where I trained myself to actually do the thing I wanted to do. So I worked with a gun dealer in town. I befriended him. I knew that I wanted to explore the subculture of female gun owners in and around this area, which is sort of a pretty rural area that hangs down from Maryland and is separated from the Washington, D.C. area by a very big bridge. Does anyone know that area? Or no? I mean, it's a pretty simple concept, women and guns. It's not like, you know, it's something that I had an interest in. Growing up, I was never around guns, and I thought, well, this is a place to start, and a place to start making images. So I shoot with film, so I still shoot with film, and I did then. So I got myself a very small medium format camera called the Mamiya 7, a really kind of lightweight and versatile camera, and started making these images. And I just show them now. I just looked at this print at my printer. This is going to be in a group show. So this work is now showing a little bit, but this series probably only has less than 10 images in it. So just to give you a sense, I'm going to have to go through this rather quickly. And I'll have a lot of stories for each image. There were some exciting times. This for me was a very exotic idea of like women hunters, young girl with a deer heart in her hand, has just killed her first deer. You know, photographically, I was starting, when I made this image and some of these other images, I was starting to feel something happening, which was really important for me. And making prints, I was coming up to the ICP. At that time, I was living in Washington, D.C. still, printing in the ICP's color darkroom, pre-digital, digital C printing even, and really starting to see some things developing and getting really excited about the possibility of photography for me, and still trying to find my way in terms of how I was going to, you know, what place I was going to have in the world of photography. But yeah, and then quite quickly I realized that, hey, you know, I don't have any formal education in photography. Maybe I want to teach someday. Maybe it might be a good thing to go back and get, you know, a degree. So I started to investigate. I'm going to stop there. Investigate graduate schools, and I already had a grad degree, but I didn't have any formal training in photography other than, you know, some classes here and there. And I applied to 4 schools and ended up getting into the SVA's MFA program, which Charles Traub is the chair of that program. Got accepted and said, okay, I'm going to come to SVA and do this. I was out in the field with these female hunters, and I knew there was something going on. I just briefly go back, indulge myself for 1 second. I took this image the same day I took this image, dead deer, and the, you know, very simple image, and became interested in the idea of this animal. What happens to this animal after it's, you know, after it meets its end? And I kind of work a little bit like a reporter. I'm always taking notes and asking people and kind of being a little intrusive sometimes and kind of just gathering information. And someone there told me, well, it either goes to the taxidermist or the meat cutter. And the meat cutter is actually, they cut up the meat, and in this community, people eat the animal. They eat, you know, as much of the animal as they can. Or they take it to the taxidermist and make a decorative piece out of it. So I went to both, the meat cutter and the taxidermist. And the meat cutter was just not a good, that wasn't an avenue for me. But the taxidermist was this sort of emporium of wonder for me, because the animals, obviously, I mean, a lot of people use taxidermy and are interested in the sort of recreation of the animal, the artifice of that recreation. But this led to, I knew I was going to SVA. I was working this sort of awful summer job, like one of those jobs where like you can't even go up to use the restroom without telling someone, you're secretary, trying to make money. But I had a couple weeks before school started. So I did some research, and I found out, just with this idea that like, there's something about taxidermy I'm interested in, and I want to be prepared for grad school. So I went on a road trip through Pennsylvania. I found out that there were many, many taxidermy schools in Pennsylvania, which is not that far from New York. So I got in the car and I did this kind of 3-week road trip to many taxidermy schools and meeting many taxidermists in and around in Pennsylvania. So some taxidermists do domestic pets. This is one of the schools. Just learned a lot about the process. I was trying to learn as much about the thing itself and making pictures along the way. And these very much were like scouting pictures for me. At the time, I thought this was my real work. This is the work. I got back, I printed the contact sheets at the ICP. I was like, had that moment of like, so nothing there. But in the end, I went back to it and really saw that there was something that now I know led me on my path. And I'm very attuned to those sorts of markers in my own work, because I think it's very important to keep not only just keep the faith in your own work, but also realize that your work often, when you think you're making it and you're really on it, you really do actually need to push it farther than you're pushing it. And you might think you're actually making your real work, but you're probably making the work that where you're gearing up to make your real work, if that makes sense. And each series is a progression. So this leads me to graduate school. I studied with an amazing, I studied with Katrine, who taught me everything I know about Photoshop, but I also studied with an amazing critique teacher named Penelope Imbrico. And I made mention of this idea, oh, taxidermy, I'm interested in taking the animals back into the woods where they were killed. You know, just be careful what you say offhandedly in front of a critique teacher, because she held me to that. She said, you should go and do this. So that was important. These images, this is not Photoshop. This is me mounting a deer head, you know, these deer heads on trees in the woods. And I used other kinds of animals too. You know, I showed this work because this was a very important step. It was like an assignment, but it was a step that got me to a town called Matamoros, Pennsylvania, which is where I created my first, this is the cover of the book, my first important body of work, which was meant to be my thesis for grad school, but another project ended up being my thesis. I worked on 2 projects at the same time. But this led me to that assignment, and all of this work I was doing led me to a town called Matamoros, Pennsylvania. The physicality of this place is very unique because it's sandwiched between the Delaware River. It's a very small town. It's Port Jervis, if anyone knows this area. Port Jervis across the into New York. It's at the corner of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And surrounding this town is this kind of big, I don't know the geological term for it, but I call it a mountain park. It's a big mountain that's kind of wilder than the surrounding area. And so I was in this town and I met a taxidermist there named David Clark, who's an amazing artist himself. I worked with him on the first project where I took all the animals back into the woods. And I just started hanging around his shop. And I knew, you know, I was in grad school, I had to do a thesis. Maybe some of you guys are feeling that pressure of like, I have to come up with something, it has to be brilliant. I have a joke with my undergrads that my eye started twitching because I was so, you know, stressed out. But I knew, you know, I was really on to something when I was feeling that kind of stress and tension. It stopped twitching, so it sometimes comes back. But that stress was good, and it really it made me go out to this town again and again and again. And what's important about this town too is that, maybe go back to the work itself, is that it was commuting distance from New York City. So while I was living in New York City and living in, you know, going to graduate school and thinking like, well, I'm not really interested in kind of shooting in New York or shooting in a studio, I was able to get out to a town of 3,000 people that was a discrete place where I could make my work. And the town itself became a kind of a stage for me to make this body of work. And so hanging out with David Clark in his taxidermy shop, just taking notes, trying to figure out what's going on, I started hearing stories from local people that would come into the shop, because there's not much in the town. He's sort of like the de facto mayor of the town. His friends would come in, local people would come in, and they would tell me about, you know, oh, you're interested in animals and art, and, you know, you should do images of, you know, the animals coming down from this big mountain park at night, at dusk, and interacting. You know, these animals are coming down every night. So I started to think about how I might, that was fascinating to me, how I might achieve that. I spent some time waiting for animals to come down. Didn't really work. They're a lot smarter than we, you know, they're very smart, and their senses are very attuned. So I decided to start using the animals that David was taxiderming to recreate these scenes of kind of nocturnal, for me, wonder in a sense. You know, the animals are coming down, they're making small migrations from the mountain to the river, or they're coming down to, you know, take advantage of the development there. You know, eating our refuse. This is called Trash Eaters. This is the first image I made for the project. You know, this was out of like nothing. This image, you know, was suddenly there after scouting and, you know, many weeks of work, but it really was something that when I saw the negative and I saw the context sheet, I said, okay, there's something here. And so I've learned a lot about coyotes and other wildlife that's indigenous to Pennsylvania since then. You know, they're coming down because it's obviously easier for them to eat our refuse than to hunt their own, you know, up in the mountains, hunt their own food. And there's more calories, more protein, and all of that. So I was very interested in this collision of the kind of the built environment and natural environment, and where this sort of humans and animals meet along this divide. So this is an image called Watering Hole, and there's just not enough time, so I'm just going to go through these quite quickly. The book is still in print, and there are small snippets of stories in the back of the book that relate to the real stories that I heard. I read them in the local penny saver. This resulted from an interview with the Department of Natural Resources out there. I heard them from local people. I talked to anyone and everyone I could. And everyone had a bear story, a coyote story, you know, some of them quite humorous. For example, this family, the bears would swim in their pool and drink out of their pool. This was when they live on the very edge, I'm not tethered, right? The very sort of edge of town. And they erected this fence around their pool because they didn't want the bears in their kind of that pool space. And so they're living on this kind of, the front line of kind of this kind of wilder space, more natural space, but in a sense they're trying to protect themselves from it. I mean, they have a small, she's probably in college now, Danielle, but they had a small child at that time and they didn't want the bears coming in. So the chain link fence is a theme that runs throughout my work because of this kind of idea of enclosure, enclosing the domestic space, but also enclosing the human, this kind of barrier between the wild animal and the human. Okay, so just to go through, so that was the structure of the project. I was working now in a new way. I had been a documentary photographer and identified myself as that before this project, but because I knew I wanted to make this work in a very precise and artful way, controlling, you know, all elements like the color of his, you know, the check of his shirt and the color of his shirt, and, you know, every detail basically, and the compositions, I started to work in a constructed way. Working with the taxidermy, which was quite important to me, that they were all local, but I was creating, you know, I was creating narratives. I was telling stories in a sense, and I was in complete control of the scene, the environment, you know, I was responsible for every detail in the images, which was very satisfying and also a little terrifying at the same time. At the same time, I was working on another body of work, which I'll show you in a second, which was a sort of an outlet from all of that construction or all of that sort of control I had to exert over this situation, but it was exciting in that sense. So there's the town down there with the river. The bears I had heard were using the cutaway area from the electrical wires to amble up and down as a kind of a not a causeway, but you know, a place for them to kind of easily go up and down the mountain. So each of these images was carefully researched, and often it was just a snippet of a story or just a little whiff of a story I would hear, and sometimes that would be enough for me to say, oh, I want to create my own sort of narrative around this, to distill down the tension and the sort of the narrative related to the story, and to try to create my own kind of version of it in a sense. Sometimes there would be, you know, a whole newspaper article about, you know, bear spotting. So 2008 hit. So I worked on this project from the summer of 2005, and I was between the 2 years of my graduate degree, to about 2008, the end of 2008, when the domesticated book came out, and it was the winner of was lucky to win the Critical Mass Book Award, and that was, you know, for someone who does not have a book published. It was a first book. And so the economic crisis hit in 2008, and it also hit this town. This is one of the last images I made. And now down by the river at this point, there were empty, you know, unfinished houses that the animals were sort of taking over again. The bobcats were down there. And I'm very interested in the edge of this town, like physically where the town ends and this kind of the mountain begins. Of course, we understand that, you know, this idea of like, that is natural, and this is the town is unnatural, and what's beyond the town is natural. Is just a construct of how we view nature, which is a man-made construct in a sense. But I was very interested in that idea because it was so clearly marked in a sense. And I mean, I'll say I grew up in a planned community outside Washington D.C. and overseas with my parents, and I think growing up in this planned community had, you know, I'm still working out those demons in a sense, because there just was, everything was very orderly, and we had squirrels were the kind of the wildest thing bumping around there in Reston, Virginia. But and the animals, I was fascinated with the animal behavior as well. So they were coming down from the mountain, and the first image where I think it's Route 17, the animals that were, you know, smart enough or resourceful enough or, you know, lucky enough not to have to cross over the highway were able to go under these drainage pipes, and that's a Staples up there, and come out the other end. And this is the end that the that the river is on. Okay, so just a few process images. You know, this is like shoestring. So at the time, I was also really interested in Gregory Crewdson. He was a really big influence on me early on. And I know like his brand of kind of, you know, spectacle and staging has become a little, you know, I don't know, a little out of style in a sense, or a little out of vogue. But at the time, I was very interested in that kind of control and that kind of beauty in my images. I mean, this is like this is his Twilight series, really. And, but I always equate, you know, my production team was myself and my husband, our little Mazda, which, you know, we fit the animals in, and then whatever animal we could wrangle for, usually overnight from the taxidermist. I had a key to the taxidermy shop, and I would return the animals, you know, after he was gone. And we did the images while there was a lot of scouting and planning. We did them usually over a Saturday, Sunday. So on the weekends, it was kind of a weekend thing, and never really had an assistant. I had an assistant out there one day for one of the images, but it was just us, you know. And I was lucky enough to work with a taxidermist who understood, you know, someone who helped me make the project, because I couldn't have done it without him, who understood what I was doing and was generous enough to allow these objects, which were not his, you know, which people were paying him to create. He had a great trust in me to, you know, to say, yeah, just return them when you're done. And yeah, it was very, very sweet. So these are just some. So I'd go and make the scouting images, hear the story, make the scouting images. I'd had everything organized. When they were ready, I would then, you know, extract them, take them from the shop, and start to try to make the image. And these are just some of the ones that I used. So this is where it begins. Trying to understand the body posture. They're rigid, so I didn't have a lot of flexibility around that. So the image needed to be sort of created around that body posture. The hunter is commissioning the animal. So in a lot of cases, like the watering hole, the girl and the bear, the animal was in a very aggressive pose. A lot of hunters want this kind of recreation of this aggressive moment, the moment they, you know, shoot the beast and it's running after them. But in many cases, these animals are not in aggressive poses. But I had to work around that because I didn't always want this sort of one note of aggression with the work. But, you know, what I find is that when I was shooting this, I thought, oh, and you know, I'm just going to skip all this, but I just want to say generally, I'm very interested. This is the light rail Coyote, if anyone remembers him. He got on outside Portland, and he wandered onto a train. He didn't know he was on a train. He ended up in the middle of Portland, Oregon. People sing songs about him. He's a folk hero. There you go. So I'm very interested in, because it was very important for me that the work be, in some sense, based in reality, or have the kind of core nugget idea sort of start with a real sighting or a real incident. I'm sort of a junkie for any kind of news around animals. The coyotes were coming up, you know, they're now in Central Park, I guess, but they were coming into Rye, New York last summer. This image, you know, this is a kind of, and it's really pixelated because it's like pulled off the internet. You know, I find this image terrifying, you know, because coyote behavior, it's a long story, but has certainly changed even since the time I started the project. And they are, you know, encroaching more into suburban areas and even urban areas. And they are becoming more emboldened. I mean, I think this is like, in a sense, I don't know, this could be a fine art image in and of itself. It's really a sort of a very interesting, intense image for me. Don't leave your cats out. And this is, you know, there was one coyote that came and got in the Quiznos. I'm not sure what, I think it was in Chicago, and tried to cool down in the Quiznos, you know, drinks cooler, and then he was taken away. And of course the media was all there. So this idea of this kind of fascination with the other, with these wild animals that you know, we're sort of overlapping in very real ways, and that is fascinating to me. Having said that, the project is over, and these are more recent incidents than my project. And so, of course, I made this image in response to these images, this idea of the bear, you know, being encased, not being able to pull off this bear was killed after 6 days of not being able to get this, I don't know, barrel of whatever, you know, jug off its head. Not jug, it's a jar. It's a jar. Yeah, it even happens to the small ones. You know, they go out of curiosity or hunger, and then they can't extract it off their head. I'd love to point this out because I only get to share this when I give talks, but this town is, as I said, at the corner of New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And there happened to be in this small town, like 5 fireworks superstores because of this kind of where it lies on the kind of state border. So I wanted to put in this Roman candle as a kind of just a little insider nod to the physicality of the place. I think it's different for each project. I think it's useful to do a book because if you can do a book and you're able to do that, then you'll know. It's kind of like you just know when you're ready. But this ended because I did this book. Many of these, I mean, probably 10 of these images are not in the book. They came after. So I wasn't actually finished with the project. The book came early because I sort of won this award and it was a kind of a special thing. It probably came, in a sense, it was premature. And I'll probably at some point republish it. But I don't know, I think it's when you sort of are done telling your story. And that can be a hard thing to identify. Sometimes you realize it was done a lot longer than, you keep working on it and you're like, wait, I think I was done. And you start making work that's repetitive or that is not as strong or you lose the energy. I'll talk about that with my next body of work. At the same time as I was working on Domesticated, I started a project called Stranded. And this is my, I guess, most recent body of work, although I have a book coming out of something else this year. But August 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And that was a hugely, it was a seismic event in the country, in the world, in politics, in any kind of anyone that was socially aware was very affected by this. And we were very affected at the SVA. And so I came back to school, I don't know, August 30th, the next day, and our chair said, what are you doing? I'm going to go forward to this image while I talk about this. What are you doing? Like, you guys should all, and he's very socially aware. His work is he's very socially aware. And he also comes from a sort of a road trip, get out, do it, look at it, go see it, feel it, smell it, all that. And he said, paying a lot of money to go to school. I'm like, okay, I'm back. I got my animal work. And, Katrina hits, and he's like, what are you doing here? Everyone should go down to New Orleans. And I was like, what? What? Go down to New Orleans? That's crazy. What? This is like days after the event is unfolding. And some people got in their cars and went down to New Orleans, or went close to New Orleans, or went, helped people in centers and things like that. I didn't go to New Orleans. I internalized all of this. I was working on Domesticated, and I just started thinking about a number of things. I was, following this very closely, as we all were, and becoming more and more kind of outraged and concerned about what was happening in New Orleans and what was being sort of made apparent to us about the state of this country. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But at the same time, I was also thinking very much at this time about a couple things. The idea of road trip photography, the idea of what to call it road trip photography sort of diminishes it in some sense, but that's, we all know what I'm talking about. The idea of getting out, getting in your car and looking at the country, at America in your time. So thinking very much about all these dudes, Stephen Shore, Joel Sternfeld, these are heroes to me, especially Joel Sternfeld, Mitch Epstein, Gary Winogrand, 1964, Robert Frank, so 50s, 60s, 70s, Alex Soth, even in a more contemporary sense, although I don't have his image here. Very much thinking about, Katrina hitting and what the state of America and where we really are as a nation, what we owe each other as fellow Americans or just human beings, and also thinking very much about the limits of portraiture. Now, I just want to talk about this very briefly. So I was in critique with many people who were doing images of people, portraits. So I'm going to go into someone's apartment and I'm going to make a picture and I'm going to spend some time with them and make this kind of disclosive, intimate image. And then we critique it. And then in the end, what more do we know about this person through a photograph, which is really about surface. And so I tried that too. I tried that. I went, having coffee with people, tea, building up the courage. Now let's take the pictures. Let's try to make the best picture we can in this environment. And I just became really disillusioned with the idea of a portrait really telling us something about the person that's not in the image, that's beyond the image, that they don't want to show. So a lot's happening here. A lot is coming together. So at the same time, I'm driving to and from Matamoros, Pennsylvania, and I start seeing people stuck on the side of the road, broken down, stranded. And I guess my antenna are up, and I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to start. There's something here. There's a kind of a metaphor to be made, in a sense, or to be explored about where I am, in my own life, where I am, where I feel politically and socially we are in this country. And I just started stopping. I just stopped for the first person, terrified, you know. I got to stop and make a picture on the side of the road. This is not the first picture I made, but so I started stopping, and I started driving all over the country to make these images and to explore the idea of being stranded, the idea of a breakdown, the idea of a personal breakdown, maybe a societal breakdown, a breakdown of sort of belief, of support, and the kind of a growing malaise in this country that increased, you know, after 2008. So I started this in 2005, and a feeling that, you know, things were not as they were, like the idea of the American dream and this kind of idea that everything's going to be okay. You know, maybe in fact it wasn't going to be okay. And this was the closest, in a sense. These folks were, it was a very mundane event to be broken down. It's like everyone's been broken down at some point, right? Like found themselves stuck on the side of the road. I mean, it's a very mundane moment, but I felt that there was something there for me artistically, personally, you know, in terms of my interaction psychologically, with me being on the side of the road, you're driving all day looking for these folks, being on the side of the road with them, you know, and the space of the side of the road, and kind of just becoming involved for a few moments, a few hours in their drama, you know, in their kind of breakdown. And that for me was a lot more direct and impactful than trying to photograph someone in their living room or in their New York apartment. So these are images from that project. That project is now finished. When did I know it was finished? Well, I got pregnant. I just had a kid 7 months ago. And I got pregnant and I was like, oh, you know, I was very excited, but I was like, what does this mean for my career? You know, a lot of things were not clear. And I was still in the midst of this project. Well, it became very clear, and then I started, you know, oh, before I get too big, but then I thought, oh, what if I do get really, you know, when I get big and I get out of the car and I'm like, I'm here to take your picture. It's gonna, people are not gonna say no, it's gonna be amazing. But it became clear that I just could not physically do it after a while. And then it became clear too for me that this project was very much about a moment in time for me. Trying to work out a sense of isolation, aloneness, vulnerability, loneliness, really, with myself. And then once I got pregnant and now I have this child, like that, those kinds of, you know, existential, you know, milkshake, that's just gone. That's just not something I'm spending my nights up thinking about. So the project, in a sense, is over. And that period of my life is over. So sometimes it works that elegantly and other times. But so it posed an issue, though, for me that I want to do a book of this as my next book, and did I have enough work? And I just had to come to terms with the fact, and I did a couple more shoots. You'll see some at the end here. I'm going to go through them kind of quickly here. I love the West. This is outside Vegas. My in-laws live in LA. I drive a lot from LA to Vegas and back and into the West. I love the West, but I've been all over the country. This is the Cajon Pass outside LA. So did I have enough work? I don't know, but I'm trying to understand whether it has to be enough. Sometimes it just has to be. You always want more. You always want more, better, you know, more choices, more, you know, a bigger book, better images, but sometimes it is what it is. I use a Google map to track my progress. Here's me taking a picture. So I'll say mostly I go on my own, but more recently my husband has come with me for a couple trips, which has given me a lot more freedom to feel like I can get in people's cars and I can take chances that I wouldn't have taken alone. But early on, I was really alone a lot. Driving, I would fly into a city, I would travel with tools, water, food, a cell phone, a AAA card, even though I didn't have a car at the time, to help people. And I was just there to photograph. I was just there to find people. And it was really quite a lonely situation, and also one that was completely not under my control. So at the same time that I was doing Domesticated, I promised you guys I would come back to this, I was also, you know, driving around the country. So I had this very specific, finely tuned, constructed project, and then I had this project that was like, get in the car, see what you find that day. You know, one of the first days I overslept. I had this awful night in a hotel. It was like, I was so scared. I'm like, I'm staying in a motel alone somewhere, like on the side of the road. I couldn't sleep, and then I overslept. And then I had an amazing day finding these people. I thought, well, if I had left earlier, I wouldn't have found, it like became clear to me, whatever happens that day is supposed to happen. And there are many days nothing happened. I drove all day, burning gas, burning, you know, fossil fuels. My carbon footprint got bigger and bigger, and not finding anyone. And I, as a student, that was difficult. But because you want to have a productive day, you want to control the situation, you want to feel like you have some, you know, you're not just being whipped around by kind of circumstance or fate. But very quickly I realized that, and I only went probably 5 days, 6 days at the longest. I couldn't sustain the isolation and that sense of unknowing. I would just go crazy. I would just have to come back and finish, just come back to New York. But each of those projects, because I worked on them together, allowed me an outlet from each other, which was very important, I think. These images are a little redder they're much redder than they are. I just had to say that. New Jersey Turnpike. So Mojave Desert. So I've been all over. I hope to do a book of this work next. Idaho, Florida. And amazing, the kinds of people I've talked to, the kinds of people I've spent time with on the side of the road. It's really been, in the end, things often look better in hindsight. They look more, oh, remember all those great times. It's been really satisfying. And it's been just, yeah, I hope that I can come up with another project idea that allows me that kind of, freedom in the world to stop and just encounter people. And people were really, really wonderful. Okay, let me move forward. Reno. Reno's one of my favorite places too. I ended up spending some time in New Orleans on a different project, working with Charlie and Charles Traub on a totally different project. So many of these images are related to, this is St. Bernard Parish, if anyone knows that area outside New Orleans. This is a really different thing for me, completely different. In the middle of the semester, if you guys remember, in 2010, I got some time off teaching, which was lovely. The chairs were lovely, to let me take a trip to Australia. I was invited to go to Australia to do 2 shows, one in Sydney of Domesticated and one in Perth of Stranded. And it was all sponsored and paid for and everything. I thought, oh, I've never been to Australia. And I have, does anyone know Stacey Marifar by any chance? Yeah, okay, great. So Stacey was an old friend from the ICP. When I was learning how to piecing it together there, she was in the full-time program there. And she married a South African that lives in Australia. And she was there, and we were still in touch. And she said, we just started talking about things. And I was going to be there for a month. I said, we started talking about this thing called the tall poppy syndrome, which is, I'll explain in a moment. And I heard the term, and I was like, what? That sounds so interesting. What is it? And this is the mock of the cover of the book. And we just said, well, maybe we should do a project together. I've never done a project with someone else, never collaborated. It's always been my way or the highway, this kind of egocentric thing. And it was a really discreet thing. 3.5 weeks in Australia. So we set up this whole situation where, and we're lucky enough now to have a book published of it, where we traveled around a region of Australia called New South Wales, which is southeast Australia. Does anyone know Australia really well? Are there any Australians here? Okay. And we explored something called the tall poppy syndrome. And it's really red. They are very sunburned there, but they're not this sunburned. So the tall poppy syndrome basically is just this idea. In Japan, it's often termed the nail that stands up will be beaten down, will be hammered down. It's this idea that if you are singular or you excel in Australian society, it's kind of a British Commonwealth term. It's prevalent in New Zealand, Australia, Great Britain, Canada to some extent. But those people will be kind of pulled down by their peers. It's not considered sort of cool to be, or it's considered sort of not acceptable to be individualist, to excel really, or to seem proud of that, of kind of being different from people around you. It's especially still prevalent in the kind of more rural areas of Australia. So I heard this term. I didn't know much about Australia. I knew about kangaroos. I knew they had a lot of surfing there. I knew there was the outback. I just went with basically cliches and icons in my head, and landed, and we got in a car and we spent a month driving around New South Wales, exploring individuals and groups and what Australian life is like. Who knew, that we could do this, but we did it. And it's going to be a book. It's kind of crazy. It's kind of dark, but I'm just going to take you through some of the images. It's a really basic idea, very, very fast project, just two photographers shooting sometimes together, sometimes separately, always from the same car, though we were always in the same car. So we didn't like diverge greatly, you know, geographically. And exploring the idea of, you know, what it means to be Australian today, and how the individual and the group kind of, you know, function together or separately, and that kind of tension. So it's very much about the kind of, you know, average Australian and the people we encountered. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know much what else I can say about it, because you know, I work on projects for 4 or 5 years. This was 3 weeks, shooting with another person. I've learned so much. We just finished editing, sequencing editing. We had an intern. It was a whole nother story. And they did a lot of contacting people beforehand. People that had won the Australia Day Award, which are these kind of, you know, people that have done amazing things in their community. And some people, we just identified groups, and we sort of talked to them about what the group meant and what the individual was doing. So we went to this kind of surfing group. There were a number of, we photographed a rugby team. We photographed a group called the Royal Flying Doctors, which are this amazing group that flies into the outback like an ambulance in the sky. You know, really kind of singular people. But we didn't, it was like, almost like, it was set up almost like a month-long magazine shoot. I mean, it was all kind of planned in a sense, but then we were able to kind of, there was some spontaneity. So some people we just found, and others, and you know, obviously when you go, you're trying to react to this environment, which is very, you know, new. And Australia is like, I mean, a lot of people say it's like America in the 60s. And it kind of does look a little bit like that. So it's a distinctly different environment, but this seems very familiar. So you're trying to react in the moment, but at the same time we had a structure and we had people we were meeting. And then in the end you come back and you kind of try to pull it all together into a statement that's not so, you know, that's not so specific or so concrete, but really speaks about, you know, what it felt like to be there and for us to explore. And we struggled a lot with, well, what did we find? You know, do we even like, we were even well equipped to do this. I mean, you know, this idea of going to another culture and trying to make a statement about that culture, I think is a really fraught proposition. But it's really just about our journey. And in the end, you know, that the statement says that. That was something that we really, did we prove it? Did we disprove it? It doesn't matter. It's just about looking for it, the search for it. And that was really in the text of the book, which, you know, when you're doing something like that that is so specific, it's about kind of, you know, trying not to be so concrete, but trying to be, yeah, you guys, loose and flexible and you know, rigid, and in some sense, rigid enough at the same time. So these are the images. 55 images. It's coming out in August with Decode books. These are the Royal Flying Doctors. Amazing. The inside of that plane is all like an ambulance, and they fly and they land in the fields, and they get the kangaroos off the fields, and like if someone has a car crash or a heart attack, it's crazy. So we drove from Sydney into the outback and then back. We did a lot of driving, and my collaborator was 7 months pregnant at the time, which was phenomenal. You know, I don't know, I still am like, oh, this work, you know, I kind of feel like a little bit of distance from this work because it's not all mine. I mean, it is and it isn't, and there's that kind of ambiguity around it. But at the same time, I've learned so much through working on this project with another person. You know, the idea of like the ego, and like the ego, you need to be an artist, and how you have to kind of put it, you know, tamp that down a little bit when you're working with someone else, and then doing the book and editing a book where half the images are not my own, and then trying to edit those images together. If you guys follow, I mean, obviously you follow photography, John Gossage and Alex Soth just did a book called The Auckland Project. They both went to New Zealand with Magnum, and they both did a book, but the book is one book, Radius published it, but it's like 2 books in one, and they're very separate. And we looked at that, but then in the end we decided to just put them together, you know, and our styles are quite similar. So we have a typology of these stunted trees, trying to make, you know, this idea of the stunting or the cutting, of personal, you know, what's the word? I'm blanking on the word. But, you know, the stunting of people who are sort of trying to excel. We used a flash on this, but not for nothing else. I never used flash, but we carried a flash around Australia. We also carried hundreds of rolls of film, probably thousands of rolls of film with us. And at one point, our assistant was like, why aren't you shooting this digitally? We were sponsored by Kodak. Thank you, Kodak. We were sponsored by Kodak. We got some very nice film that they sent us, but logistically, it was, I don't know really how to use flash. Strobes. I do, but I just don't feel that comfortable with them. So, and my work is really not about that aesthetic. So here we go. So this is it. Just a few more. I haven't. Yeah, I think this is it. This is the last. This is the cover and the last image in the book. So that's tall poppy syndrome, and that's. I want to know if you guys have any questions. He's asking about the tighter portraits that are verticals, how they can be incorporated with, and I have about 4 of them. Yeah. I'm very aware of them. They are often in shows that I do. I love the tighter portraits. I love the verticals, and I love the kind of the intimacy. You know, getting very close. I mean, the first one I took was at the Cajon Pass. This guy who just like didn't even speak English and was just like, "What are you doing?" So how are they integrated? I don't know. I was trying to edit the book, and one of my sort of brilliant photo friends suggested that it go from like being farther away to closer, and that's a good structure for a book. That could be something, you know, Paul Graham does something like that with his, I think it's called one of his books where the heads are moving. But I don't know. They're just gonna exist. They might exist in the middle of the book. For the Tall Poppy book, we have. This is one of the structures. So when you're thinking about a book, as I flip back and forth and terrify everyone, we have 2 gatefolds in the book. And I looked at my friend Brian Ulrich's book. He has, if you guys know, is this place great or what? He has 2 images that open up, and they open to 4 closed circuit cities. And so we looked at that, and we had a lot of these we're talking about the individual and the group. But in some cases, we photographed individuals alone, you know, and we wanted to sort of somehow gang them up. And so we have 2 gatefolds. These 2 guys open up to a gatefold of these 4 trees. And then we have the 2 sets of rugby players. I'm only showing you one. The women and men, and they open up to a set of miners, gold miners. There's a lot of gold mining. And so, yeah, that's how we kind of solve that issue. And so they open up, and they're kind of this, you know, thing that's embedded in the book that might be a nice surprise or allows you to see 4 individual faces at once that are kind of, you know, a typology in a sense. So that might be something for Stranded, or they may just be in the book somewhere. I don't know. You know, in some cases, if I could get closer to people, I made that image. But in some cases, I couldn't. Like, you're on the side of the road. You're like, things are moving very quickly, or people are busy, or they're just like, well, I'm not going to stop. You can make an image as I do what I need to do. So you know, and I'm an opportunist. I took the chance to make those images. But there's something about, and that's something I get asked a lot, actually. There's just something about the kind of you know, one of my favorites is Gus here, who's just come from his chef job, and I just kind of love them. I don't know, I feel closer to them in a sense than I do some of the other images. I don't know. I also like verticals. The crazy thing about, well, it's not crazy, but for me, interesting thing about the Australia project is it's mostly verticals. So we're going with a vertical book. I like to think of myself as a predator, yes. Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an issue. And it's something I used to, you know, I apologized in many ways about asking people for their image. I apologized through bringing them things, through, you know, providing. I still want to provide some help if I can, and I have really done that in many cases. But I was always trying to mitigate what I was asking, you know, because it's so strange and it's so, in the sense, it's intrusive. But I've come to, now maybe that I'm done, I can be a little bit more kind of, you know, I don't know, I have more of a perspective on it. But now I just, and someone has said to me, you know, you're out there to make images. It's okay not to apologize for that. And I'm pretty, like as I've spent more and more years photographing, I'm just more aware that I'm there to do that. And yeah, I am. I'm looking for people broken down. I'm hoping I find them. And if I don't find them that day, I'm upset. I have to go to some cold, dark, you know, hotel room, like not hotel, motel room, the cheapest one I can find, you know, on the side of the road, and like you know, the ones that like, you know, there's no lobby, you kind of go and you open the door and there's a big car out there, and then kind of sit there all night going like, what am I doing? You know, why am I in the middle of nowhere? Because I'll go to the last light, because I don't shoot at night, it's too dangerous, and then just stop, and then the next morning pick it up. And so if I haven't found my prey, I get, I get upset. Australia is completely model released. We were working with an assistant. We had, you know, and it's been amazing for knowing people's names. Now we have to do titles for everything, so that's one thing. Just keeping track of, administratively keeping track of what you've done, where you've done it. I have no model releases for Stranded. I've never been asked for a model release. You know, I get asked this a lot. I do, when I stop and, you know, I spend time with them, I ask them for their first name. I make very careful notation of where I found them, because I have it on Google Map. I try to track it down, not to the, you know, the exact, you know, spot, but basically within a mile of the place I found them. But it's important for me to know where they were in you know, along the roadside. And then I offer them, I say, you know, do you do email? If they do email, I ask them to email me with a little description, you know, oh, Gus, and, you know, I had the hat on, I was a chef. And then if they email me, I send them a print. If they say I don't do email, then I get their information and I send them a print. So I then have a digital record of all the people I photographed. Not all, because some people, you know, surprisingly are not on email yet. But no releases. I've never used releases. But through Australia, because I was working with someone who was very meticulous, we had releases. But no one has asked, publishers, no one asks. No, I mean, and you know, there's this idea, I always say, of implicit consent. They're looking at me, I'm looking at them. These images are taken with absolute permission. You know, they're not, nothing's grabbed, nothing's taken, as people are like, no, if someone says no, I just say, can I help you? And then if they say no, and then I just leave. Well, I stop for almost anyone that it seems like it's safe to stop for. The only reason I wouldn't stop, I mean, I want to investigate. This girl, so I'd been driving all day. I just did a talk in Lexington, Kentucky, and this is outside Lexington. I've been driving all day, hadn't found anyone. It was like one of those cold, like November cold days, and I was in grad school. I had taken this is the first trip, and I was trying to prove out the project, like prove to my critique class and to myself that there was something there. And I pulled up on this van. I saw the van, just a red van on, you know, up in the distance. I said, well, this is what you're here for. You've got to stop and go up to this van, totally closed up. It's like November, and knock on the door, and there's a guy inside. He's on oxygen, actually. He said his wife went back to town to get gas, but maybe his kids are interested. So the back of the van opens up, and these girls jump out, these 3 girls. And I mean, it's one of those things that, you know, you have this amazing situation, and like all the images were amazing, like almost better than any other images, but you have to choose one. And so this little girl, Perry, was the girl, you know, she was cold, she put her arms in. It's just this moment. I've forgotten your question. Well, how do I choose my models? So you never know, you know, so I had to I investigated. Maybe going up to a van wasn't the smartest thing, but at that point I was desperate, and it yielded this picture. I never try to, I'm driving I drive as slowly as I can, but I mean, I'm approaching someone. I can't investigate, you know, who looks good. I just stop and I see what's there. Some people were really boring looking. You know, they were just really boring, or I couldn't make a good picture. Many images are not in this, but other things happen in the moment. So I've never really worked with models. All the people in the domesticated are local people. I'm not that picky. I think that real people look really interesting. So not everyone, and the ones that aren't very good or don't know how to pose or are weird, you just edit those out. So I've never actually said, like, worked with models. I think it's good not to give too much information. And also, I don't talk to them that much. When I'm shooting them, I try to be really quiet when I'm shooting them. I know I'm talking a lot now, but I try to, like, really be calm. And once I ask permission and I get permission, to be too chatty with I think that's something my students do a lot too. It's like, it kind of breaks whatever. I'm interested in a kind of a real stillness and a real intensity in the images. And and people get uncomfortable when you don't talk to them. They expect to be chatted to, and or sometimes it's really loud where we are and we can't, or we're far away from each other. But I tell them I'm working on a book. People seem to kind of react positively. And most people say yes. I mean, I would say only a handful of people have said no. I'm not. No. You know, I don't want to do that. Out of hundreds. But You know, you learn through trial and error. I never say fine artist. I never say gallery. I never talk about. They just don't. People don't. I used to carry a little postcard, and like I'd give it to someone, they'd give it back to me. I'm like, no, you keep it. No, like it just was like, what? Like, what are you trying to sell me something? Like what? I'm like, no, this is just for Domesticated early on, some of those pictures were printed in like Oprah magazine or like magazines that people like understood. So when I would go to someone's door, I would say, oh, this is who I am, and I just want to show you. And they knew the images, and they were sort of like, they had like, it's a small town, so, oh, she wants to photograph us now, and like, we're going to be in Oprah magazine. Like, that's, yeah, I try to be as cool about that as I can, giving them enough information for them to say yes, but not too much information for them to start thinking like, what do you do? What? And I also have a big camera on a tripod, so I think that also, look, I'm like, professional. Yeah, professional, and yeah. So, but when I go up to them initially, I don't have my camera. I leave the camera in the car. I have a light meter around my neck. For some reason, this light meter is like this talisman for me. It's like this light meter. And then the light meter is great. I know, maybe with the digital, people don't use light meters, but you get to be close to the person. You get to get, up, and you get in their space, and they ask about it. The light meter is a hugely useful tool, I think, maybe more so than the camera. It's too bad it doesn't actually take pictures, because it's an interpersonal tool, that you can use to break that barrier with your subject. So I use that a lot. And then I go back to they say, yeah, I'll go back to my car, and then I'll bring this gear, and they're just probably like thinking, oh, I just thought you were going to take a snapshot. And people are also kind of taken off guard that I'm even there. Sometimes they're scared. Yeah. You pull up and you run out, you jump out of your car, and I've had people alone be kind of calling, oh, there's this woman here, and I don't really know what's going on. When the whole time I was thinking like something's going to happen to me, I'm the predator. I've been stopped by the police. Yeah, stuff like that. The state troopers are like, are you preying on stranded motorists? Well, in a sense, yes. But then I showed my first book, and like I just try to talk my way out of it and not get flags so that someone, if they stop me up the road. It's illegal to stop on the side of the road if you don't have to as well. So, yeah. So I'm doing that again and again and again.